After the success of Fatal Attraction in 1987, Hollywood churned out a glut of glossy thrillers through the late 80s and early 90s, which weirdly blended the tropes of romance movies or erotic films with gory, violent horror.
I love you, Laura. I can't live without you, and I won't let you live without me.
In 1991, Julia Roberts, hot off the back of Pretty Woman, starred in a tense cat-and-mouse thriller about a woman in witness protection being pursued by her violent and abusive ex-husband. A few years later, up-and-coming actress Reese Witherspoon starred opposite Marky Mark Wahlberg in Fear, a cult sleepover teen hit which begins as your classic cheesy teen romance, but ends in a violent, brutal home invasion.
You should have allowed nature to take its course. In the end, it will anyway. So let me the fucking out! Go to call and lock your door!
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss Sleeping with the Enemy and Fear. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munter. As ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in our 9th series exploring the evolution of home invasion movies, and this is part 16. In this episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two classic thrillers from the 90s. That's Sleeping with the Enemy from 1991 and Fear from 1996. Both of these discussions will, of course, be spoilerific, so if you can, please give both movies a watch before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss these two weird and wonderful movies, I have got a very good friend of mine, a friend of the podcast. She is the co-host of my favourite podcast, Faculty of Horror, and she is an unabashed fan of cheesy, glossy 90s horror movies. It's Alex West. Hello, Alex.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. How's life? How's Toronto?
It is steamy. It is sweaty.
Oh.
It feels like the perfect time to talk about these kinds of films.
Oh my god, it really is. Things are going to get steamy and sweaty when we talk about these two films, right? But let me start off by asking you, Alex, what are your thoughts on home invasion films generally? The term home invasion can be quite broad. I'm taking it as quite broad in this series, but when you hear the words home invasion, what do you think of?
It is a subgenre about the personal, because our homes are sanctuary, hopefully. And then we think about housing inequality. We think like there's so many discussions happening. Certainly in Toronto, and basically everyone who I talk to, there's some kind of housing crisis happening where we are. And so we all have kind of a tenuous relationship, and sometimes with our homes, and sometimes it can feel very, very precarious. But if you've got a home that you love and you feel safe in it, the idea of having those boundaries crossed is really scary and really terrifying. And there's something about having this space that hopefully you're able to curate.
Yeah.
And you're able, like, I'm looking behind you and I'm like, yes, there's like the posters and the DVDs and the Blu-rays. And behind me, I've got like all of these books and all of my posters. And if someone came in here and like did something to this, I would be devastated.
Yeah, absolutely. There is something truly frightening and devastating about it, isn't there, I think?
Like, outside of our kind of like corporeal bodies, this, like, our homes are usually the next kind of physical representation of ourselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what do you think of the films just to watch? I mean, obviously, quite a few of these home invasion films are important to the new French extremity movement, of course, right? Which you wrote a book on. You're kind of very much an expert on, movies like Them and, of course, Martyrs, Inside, right? But what do you think of them as movies to watch? Do you enjoy home invasion films?
I just think they are so effective. And we are sold so much fear about like protecting our home and like security. And especially as a woman myself living alone, there is a lot of kind of sense of precarious nature. Like, what am I going to do if someone gets in here?
Oh my God.
I've got weak podcasting arms, Mike.
Oh my God. Tell me about it, Alex. Absolutely tell me about it. What have you ever, if you don't mind me asking, have had anything close to that happen to you before? Have you had any kind of break-in or home invasion happen to you?
I haven't personally had a break-in. I will say the closest I ever got was, at least like 5 or 6 years ago now. No, probably even a bit longer, but I was living with roommates. And we're all very close friends. We still are. And I got home from work one day and our front door was wide open.
Oh, God.
And we were like the front of the house. And I like remember just like walking through the house being like, Joanne, Adam, who's home? And just wanting to make sure like their cat was okay. And I just remember like walking through this house like a fucking idiot. Like I was exactly the person that if it was a horror movie, everyone would have been screaming at me. Yeah. Like, and we had like we had 2 floors and I even like went upstairs and was walking around and like poking through, like looking behind doors. And I got a hold of my roommate. She was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I think I probably just didn't close the door hard enough or something. So it was fine in the end, but it was a very unsettling experience to again walk through this place that I knew so well. I'd lived there for years. I knew where all the stuff is. And there was a sense that it was out of place and it wasn't mine, maybe.
Oh my God. It's such a frightening thing, right? I think like, and for so many people it is, you know, I've had a lot of listeners and even guests tell me that they find this kind of subgenre the most kind of frightening, the most triggering and that kind of thing. And I think that's because everyone has a story like that, right? To some extreme or you know, or the other. Like there is always something that someone has experienced or nearly experienced like that, I guess.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It's again, we go back to like the personal and just how close and how tangible all of this stuff is. Like if something goes missing, if like, I don't know about you, like I am such a creature of habit. Like my keys go in the same place every time. My mugs are arranged in a certain way. We can talk about that in one of the movies, but like I am so regimented in some of these ways in my life. And it like this was fucked with, I would be a wreck.
100%. And there's been a kind of flip side to this subgenre that I've been exploring too, which is more these movies that date back to films like Gaslight. This idea of kind of like the danger is already in the home with you, I suppose, right? Whether it's the abusive husband or whatever, like this idea that the real monster was inside the house with you the whole time. And this kind of wave, I mean, last week we talked about Fatal Attraction and this idea of like somebody infiltrating and ruining your kind of like domestic equilibrium, I suppose, right? Like ruining your home life in some horrific way. We got quite a wave of them at this time, it feels like, right? Which is really interesting.
Yeah, and have you recovered from the bunny boiling?
I've not yet recovered, Alex, from the bunny boiling. We had to make sure the bunnies were not in the room when that when that scene was played. That movie, do you know what? That movie still really packs a punch, particularly that kind of, and I know obviously that was all changed and everything, but that final showdown at the end in the bathroom, because these movies, and we'll talk about this with these two, I'm sure, like, you know, they start off and you're like, oh, this is kind of like, it's quite tame and it's all kind of like schmaltzy, romancy, erotic stuff, but then it goes hard on like the slasher stuff, doesn't it, as well? It's really interesting.
Yeah. Again, like the way these films and this movement of films kind of blend sex and violence is so interesting and fascinating, and I think we'll talk about often very conservative.
Ooh, that is interesting. Well, let me ask you first of all, what do you think of this wave of movies? Am I right in thinking you came to the kind of erotic thrillers of the 80s and 90s fairly recently? We were messaging about it, but you kind of discovered them and watched all of them during lockdown. Is that right?
It was just something that I think as many of us were, looking to fill my evenings during the pandemic before we had vaccines and then with Omicron again. And I was, stuck by myself and worked my way, like curated my own series of these erotic thrillers because I had a lot of enjoyment with films like Fatal Attraction and Basic Instinct and even Disclosure. The trifecta of Michael Douglas's dick is magic and no woman can resist it. But I also was like, these are so problematic. And they, as I said, like they have all these conservative values baked into the narratives. And if you think about like, what are the morals I am taking away from these films, they are that like sex outside of marriage is bad and you should be scared of it. So I got really into it. And it was such a weird and interesting thing to experience, especially because this was after I separated from my now ex-husband. And I was like in this, like, I'm figuring things out. And I was like, marriage is a sham, except for yours, Mike. Your marriage seems lovely.
Thanks, Alex.
Yours is different.
But you're right. I mean, they do make marriage quite frightening in these films. And I think it's this weird mix too. I mean, I some people have been thoroughly against me covering these films on a horror podcast, right? I've had some cross listeners write in to say these aren't horror, blah, blah, blah. But they are. They're just a weird mix. These films are unique in that they play out as kind of 50% rom-com almost and 50% horror, right? Which we'll get into. But Sleeping with the Enemy is a kind of Julia Roberts rom-com in the middle section, right? It's bookended by these horrific moments of kind of cat and mouse thriller, and Fear, which is a super cheesy teen romance until it really isn't in the final act, right? So they were such a strange little wave of films, and they're hard to put in a box. And I think at the time they were considered pretty trashy, even though they all did very well commercially, right? But I think nowadays they're being reassessed, it feels like. You know, people are looking back at them quite fondly. I recently made a video essay for the BBC with Catherine Bray, where she kind of talked about this little unique movement of films. Obviously, Karina Longworth at the moment has got a series of You Must Remember This that is focusing on the erotic thrillers of the 80s and 90s. What do you think it was about this era, and what kind of sparked this popularity of this type of movement? Was it the success of Fatal Attraction, do you think?
Yeah, there were some precursors to that. And I think for anyone who's really interested, I definitely echo the recommendation of Karina Longworth's You Must Remember This podcast. But really, like, these erotic thrillers, and I'll say erotic in air quotes, but they really stem from and are descendants of the film noir genre, the kind of thriller with a sexy dangerousness to them. But really, when we talk about, the erotic thrillers of the 80s moving into the 90s, they are truly in line with a kind of Reagan conservatism, a response to the AIDS epidemic, this fear of what happens outside of the nuclear heteronormative family. And it was also kind of like a tawdry outlet for audiences because, I think we are, Mike, you and I are not the same age, around the same age. And you and I can remember a time where we didn't have the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, it was, odd to think about, now it's really odd to think about a time where it's like, you can't easily access porn, or like you hear about a sex thing and you're like, I can just Google that and figure out what that is.
Yeah.
And so it's really odd to think about, like, a lot of people must have had their first experience or knowledge of like kink and sex and like all of these kind of things through these films. And what I find so interesting about films in general, especially big popular films, is how they turn something that can be really personal and private and cool, and then they try to mainstreamify it. And they try to make it for all of these audiences. And I think our kind of nostalgia for these films now is that we don't have many of them. We'll talk about this, but, we are in the age of, superhero movies and big budget, action set pieces and franchises. And, everyone always like wrings their hands and is like, where is the mid-budget adult thriller? And then they make them and it doesn't do as well anymore, it seems like.
I know. I feel like this is something that I think Catherine Bray made the point about in her video essay, that genre almost moved over to television now, like HBO stuff, right? It's more like that. That is where you'll find your kinky sex stuff, right? Much more than in cinema. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and even in the 90s, you had things like the Red Shoe Diaries, and things were starting there. But I think then you get, as like HBO gets into Sex and the City and things like that, you begin to have a much broader conversation about sex. And then with the rise of the internet, it's like, you can have a kind of mainstream conversation, if not a bit naughty, with like your HBO shows. But then if you just want the sex, you can go find sex on the internet.
It's so true. I remember that growing up, actually, that, you know, around the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, my adolescent years, Channel 5 that we have here in the UK, which is a pretty shit TV channel, Alex. Like, it plays like trash most of the week. But on a Friday night around that time, every Friday at around 10 p.m, they would play some kind of sexy erotic thriller. And I remember discovering this and discovering movies like Sliver and Basic Instinct and being like, oh my God, like this was at the time the only access to sexy smut.
Yeah, because otherwise you're like, I don't know about you, but certainly I remember in my like local video stores, they had porn, but it was like behind the curtain. It was so like, I remember like going to rent movies with my friends and we'd look and be like, who's going in there?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
It was so
you couldn't
weird.
be seen to go and look over there, right? You couldn't do that. Yeah, exactly. And Soho here in London, which is where people would be able to go in their like weird raincoats and sit in public cinemas and watch porn, right, as well. And that obviously doesn't exist anymore either. So, you know, it's true. It was a weird, different time. But also this kind of stuff is really interesting because it is quote unquote erotic, but it's kind of softcore, but also it's with these A-list stars a lot of the time. This is what's really interesting about this movement, right? It's kind of trashy and sleazy, but you've got like Glenn Close, Julia Roberts, you know, whoever, Sharon Stone, like all of these people, these kind of, it's like high-end B-movie or something, isn't it? It's a really weird, interesting mix. Yeah.
And I think what's important to remember about those examples that you cited, that particularly with Glenn Close and Sharon Stone and Fatal Attraction and respectively Basic Instinct, those were their breakout roles.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. So they were less known. Yeah.
They were less known, but then they became like, they almost just skyrocketed to the A-list. In part because they both are great actors who give incredible performances with really challenging roles. And then even something like we'll talk about, but with Julia Roberts, like really Pretty Woman kind of came out of nowhere. No one expected it to do that well.
Yeah.
And then she was immediately kind of pushed on to do Sleeping with the Enemy. And I think, so when you look at this kind of like early stage of these erotic thrillers, there is a sense of like, oh, okay, there is a draw for them. People are going to see it. This is a period in the 90s. We were still in a monoculture, and like they could, you know, dominate headlines and talk shows and all of those things. So a lot of actors could see like, oh, this could be my way in. Yeah. This could be a way to reignite my career or get a kind of foothold in a door that I didn't have access to previously. And especially if you look at like some of the other films like Single White Female, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle.
Yes.
All of those became super big pop culture events. And I think also from a studio perspective, it's important to remember that these films are relatively cheap to produce. They aren't a genre film. They aren't like a big action or sci-fi film. So they could invest more in like the actors and get those A-list names in there. So that's where you can get, like pull in the Michael Douglas or someone like that.
And you mentioned there is a kind of link to things like film noir and stuff. And that's what it reminds me of. It reminds me of movies, even movies that I've covered earlier on in this particular season from the 30s and 40s, and films that were considered quote unquote women's pictures, right? That were aimed at a female audience, that were usually kind of set in domestic spaces and were about women. Do you think that's the case here with these films? You know, because in some ways they share similarities. They are domestic set, they are often starring, and they are about women. Were these made for a female audience, would you say?
I think that's such an interesting question. And I've looked into this and I haven't been able to find a lot, but what I can imagine the audience to be is obviously it's adults.
Yeah.
I'm thinking kind of like 30s and 40s, maybe a bit older, maybe a bit younger. But it reminded me a lot of some research I've been doing recently and about the marketing and media that was happening, especially in the US around the 1950s and even a bit into the 1960s, where so much media and so much content was centered around telling women that their happiness lied at home. Their happiness lied in producing children and making your husband happy. And, this was in part to like fight communism, and like the big thing the West had over communists in their mind was the nuclear family and protecting that nuclear family. And I think a lot of that can be pulled into the erotic thriller genre because they are like, they're just tawdry and just kinky enough to kind of turn you on a bit, maybe. But at the end, you go home with your spouse or to your spouse and you're like, wow, I am so glad I've got this like normcore husband who isn't going to be like a freak.
That is so true, isn't it? But then also there is a kind of sexy male gaze element to it as well, of course. But then there is some stuff for the women as well. Although, why is it that all of these movies star Michael Douglas, Alex? Like, what is it about Michael Douglas?
I think because he has this, like, American man energy. Yeah. I do find it interesting in some of those films I mentioned, particularly when you look at, like, his journey, but his ability to be, I think, is good in both Fatal Attraction and Basic Instinct. And those are two very different roles.
Yes.
Like, normcore husband who wants to have a bit of an adventure to like sleazy LA cop.
Yeah.
And he's got enough of a name, but like, you know, he doesn't do it for me. And so I also have this like fascination with like Michael Douglas, really? But then in real life, he got Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Unbelievable.
But I will say, like, it's interesting. I remember watching during my initial, like, oh, I'm going to, you know, do this erotic 90s thrillers for myself thing. And I finally watched Adrian Lyne's second or first film, 9.5 Weeks.
Oh, yes.
With Kim Basinger and Mickey Rourke. Yeah. And I remember for, like, the first, like, half hour, 40 minutes of this movie, I was like, fuck me up, Mickey Rourke. Yeah. Like, it's hot. It is sexy. Yes. I'm like, look at this sex positive movie. Yes. This is great. Yeah. And then it like goes so fucking, well, it doesn't go so fucking dark, but it goes like very conservative and like weird. And you're just like, oh God, I saw a glimmer of like a sex positive movie about a woman like rediscovering her life post-divorce. And it all goes to hell.
It's so interesting, isn't it? And I wonder if
But Mickey Rourke, young Mickey Rourke is...
Unbelievable.
He can get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, why wasn't... Yeah, that's the thing. There are other men in these movies where I'm like, I get it. Michael Douglas, I just don't get it. It's so funny. But he is a good actor, like you said. He is good.
He is.
And also the guys that he plays, particularly in those two, in Fatal Attraction and Basic Instinct, they're both kind of douchebags, right? As well. Like, you know, he's good at playing a kind of douchey, you know, sleazeball, basically. So, yeah.
I liked him a lot better. I thought he was better suited to a role, and it doesn't always get thrown in with the erotic thrillers, but I think it was from like the late 90s, but it's A Perfect Murder.
Oh, yeah.
With Gwyneth Paltrow and Viggo Mortensen.
Is that that's the Dial M for Murder? Like,
yes,
remake kind of thing. Yeah.
Like inspired by, and like as the like jealous, aggressive husband. Yeah. I was like, I get that more than like sexy, desirable thing. But maybe that's also our generation.
I do actually think, though, Sharon Stone, as well as being unbelievably sexy, is a really good actress. Like, every time I watch her, I'm like, she's fucking brilliant, you know, and it's kind of sad.
I will die on the Sharon Stone hill.
Yeah, she's so good. She's so good. And this is the other thing, right, is that all of these actresses got some amazingly fun roles to play in these movies, right, as well, you know, and a lot of them I kind of really equate with just this era as well. Like, we didn't really get to see much of, you know, people like Linda Fiorentino or Jean Triplehorn or some of these like other actresses that were so just within that space, but they all got to play some awesome fun roles in these movies too, right, which is cool.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you get to have those kind of like big bombastic character trajectories, it can be really fun. I think there is a lot of discourse, and now I think I'm seeing more and more conversation about the conditions on set, particularly for sex scenes. Like the idea of an intimacy coordinator was like, don't even know what that is back then. And especially just to go back to 9.5 Weeks, like what happened to Kim Basinger on that set was disgusting and really scary and really traumatizing for her. So I think, like there are these kind of big, juicy character bits, but then you have to parse it out with how they were feeling on set and if they had even talked about it at all. Because you imagine that some of that had to have been not super cool back in that era.
Yes, I think that's so true, actually. And I think it's fascinating to look at this era as a kind of midway point almost between the kind of 80s teen slasher movies and then the late 90s teen slasher movies too. Because what we got here, these movies were taking tropes, I feel like, from 80s slashers. They're quite slashery movies in a way. And they have that conservative kind of sex equals death message about them that the 80s slashers had. Yes. But they were glossier, right? They had bigger stars in them. They had bigger name directors making them. They had higher budgets, right? And they were aimed at a bigger audience and a more grown-up audience. But then what happened with the 90s is that, and I know you wrote about this in your book, Alex, is that it feels like this era of movies then migrated and evolved into being movies aimed for teens, because you get movies like Fear, which obviously we're going to talk about later, which is essentially Fatal Attraction for teenagers, right? And then that, along with Scream in 1996, kicked off this wave of teen slashers, right? But they were sort of glossier and more high-end than the 80s ones. So I think it's really interesting to look at this era of kind of grown-up, high-end erotic thrillers as the kind of midway point between the two slasher booms, in a way.
Yeah, and I think, if we, as horror fans, if we think back to, the slashers of the 80s, and it's such, it's so stereotypical to have like, oh, they're going to go have sex. Oh, they're going to get like murdered. That's what happens.
Yeah.
But I think what begins to happen in the 90s within teen films is you move from kind of like the John Hughes, maybe they're interested in sex, maybe things are happening, to a much more overt notion of sex as punishment. And that becomes like a really big narrative linchpin in these films, less so than like two side characters who go off and fuck. This is, someone was interested in sex. They pursued it. Bad things happened to them because of this.
Yes. So before we get into these two films specifically, do you have any other favorites, Alex? Having binge watched all of these movies from this era, any faves for you?
I mean, how much time do you have? I mean, I think my first one will surprise not you, certainly, but that's Jennifer Lynch's Boxing Helena.
Oh my God, yeah. And we've talked about this together before, right? Because you were the one that introduced me to this film. You showed me this film. Jennifer Lynch, of course, David Lynch's daughter. This film is not very well known, but you recommended it to me. It's brilliant.
It's the craziest film ever made. And I struggle with David Lynch as a filmmaker. Like, I really want to love him, but I don't have that connection to his work, and I'm going to keep trying, but I struggle. So when people are like, what's your favorite Lynch film? And I'm like, Boxing Helena.
Yeah. Yeah, fair.
But it's such an interesting, if anyone who hasn't seen it, it's not available. So I encourage people to find streams of it or download.
Yes. Yeah, seek it out.
Seek it out. But it's because she wrote the screenplay. Jennifer Lynch wrote the screenplay when she was something like 19. She directed the film when she was like 22. So it's a very odd take on sex and love and passion and desire and control. It's also the film that Kim Basinger, to bring her back into the conversation, bankrupted herself over so she didn't have to appear in it.
Wow, yeah.
Which is a fascinating like little footnote in Hollywood. And then, I mean, era, I took 90s very liberally here to mean 90s / into the early 2000s. Yeah. But I would put like David Cronenberg's Crash in there. I think that is just, it's bleak, it's messy, it's sexy, good times.
So good. I almost forget about Crash. Like, that's almost its own separate thing in my head, right? But it does so fit with those others. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And then, of course, Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, amazing.
Kubrick. Amazing. I mean, it just is such a strange movie, and I don't know how I feel about anything at the end of it, but I like that about the movie.
Yeah.
And then finally going, I think, into the early 2000s, but Jane Campion's In the Cut.
Oh, that's great as well. And I feel like that's getting reappraised as well, because wasn't that a movie that sort of ruined Meg Ryan's career as well at the time, right?
This was around the time like she really wanted to get out of the rom-coms and try to do different things. And I think she put a lot of her star power behind getting it made. It was one of the first times I saw Mark Ruffalo playing a character, like a very like seedy detective who is very different from all the roles he kind of does now. And it's still like...
It's great. It's really good.
Great.
Yeah. Good choices. Eyes Wide Shut was definitely one of those movies I saw late one night when I was young, and I did not know how to feel about it. I was like, there is something very cold and scary about it at the same time as all this really, really sexy stuff is happening. Like the orgy scene with the masks, I was like, I don't know what this is. Or am I supposed to be terrified by this scene, or am I supposed to be really turned on by this scene, or both? Because like, I didn't understand what I was looking at.
And again, like this is like a lot of people's, not everyone's, but a lot of people's first experience with the idea of like an orgy, of a sex party, of things like that. And it's like the most elaborate, like over the top version of it. But, you know, it's definitely like present in like, let's see what's out there and let's show you something else that's out there.
We were also talking, Alex, and you recommended to me to check out Sliver. That is one of the most bizarre movies I've ever seen as well. It's Ira Levin, right? It's based on an Ira Levin novel, and like it really it sets itself up to be this like really intriguing mystery set in this apartment block. And then it just kind of goes a bit insane towards the end. And I can't help but, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I kind of feel like that movie felt like it had some sort of studio interference or something, because I feel like the last 10 minutes, it just kind of stops as well. It was really strange, but there's some really interesting stuff in that movie as well.
Yeah, that's such a fun one. And it's also like, again, you've got Sharon Stone with Joe Esterhaus back. So like reteaming them from Basic Instinct. So there was a lot of hype around that, and it just never reached the heights that Basic Instinct did, and, you know, whatever could. But again, it's like, I think so many movies of this era are just weird. Like,
yes,
I love watching these movies and being like, a group of adults sat around a table and said, let's make this, let's go into production on it, and let's release it to the public. Like, I love that.
I know. It's so good. And they are almost like camp in terms of, they take themselves they're quite earnest. Like Sliver was so funny because it was very earnest, and it has this like sleazy early 90s music by like Enigma and stuff, right? And like, it's so funny. I was like, this looks at first glance like a parody almost, but it's not. And it's kind of fascinating in that regard, you know?
And I think that's why, like, despite all the conservatism that exists within these films, I still get a lot of joy watching them because they are like too serious for their own good. So they become kind of silly relics of an outdated time.
Exactly that. Well, there we go. Well, speaking of, let's begin our deep dive. So we're going to start by talking about the Julia Roberts classic, Sleeping with the Enemy from 1991.
I had a husband. He hurt me.
She was the only thing I ever loved.
I guess I'm just really afraid.
She changed her name.
6 months ago, your wife removed her mother from this institution.
Look, there's obviously some mistake. My wife drowned.
I left him, Mom.
She changed her looks.
What are you doing here?
Waiting for you. I want this taken very seriously.
She's looking for you.
She changed her life.
If you need any help, I'm here.
Is she with someone?
I don't know where.
Think!
The woman she used to be is dead.
Are you okay?
Saying goodbye to old ghosts, you know.
But the man who always wanted her,
Where does she hunt?
still wants her back.
I know your every thought, Laura. Nothing could keep me away. I can't live without you. And I won't let you live without me.
Julia Roberts is Sleeping with the Enemy.
The film follows Laura, played by Julia Roberts, who's on the run from her abusive husband, Martin. The first act of the film takes place at the couple's beautiful and modern Cape Cod home, where the toll of Martin's abuse is explored. Laura fakes her death and escapes to Iowa to start a new and simple life. Due to a series of misfortunes, such as a call from Laura's friend to Martin, and Martin finding Laura's wedding ring in the toilet, he figures out she's alive and tracks her down, attacking her and her new love interest Ben. Laura fights back and kills Martin, ending the violence.
Oh, lovely. Always love a Faculty of Horror plot synopsis, you know? It's my favorite.
Yeah. We hate doing them, so I'm glad you enjoy them.
I know, so I'm very grateful. So what are your thoughts on Sleeping with the Enemy, Alex? When did you first come to it? Was it during this kind of wave of thrillers that you were watching at the time?
Yes.
What are your thoughts?
And this was the one that kind of kicked off my whole actually I want to look up all the films. I want to find out where they're streaming and watch them all, because it is so tonally uneven.
Yes.
But I think it is so watchable.
Yes.
And it is fascinating seeing so many of our A-list biggest celebrities in the world in these films. And you can see often oh my God, Julia Roberts is a star.
Oh my God, yeah.
This film works in large part because of Julia Roberts. And I'm not really a Julia Roberts fan at all, but she is undeniably charismatic, attractive, holds the screen. It's wild. And I'm she absolutely should have gotten paid $1 million at 22 years old to be in this bizarre movie. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I saw this when I was quite young, I think. I grew up with older sisters, and, they did gravitate towards these sorts of movies in the 90s, particularly Julia Roberts. I remember Pretty Woman was on pretty hard rotation when I was a kid. I kind of absorbed a lot of these movies through osmosis, I think, when I was a kid growing up. But I remember finding it... as a kid, pretty boring until it suddenly got really, really scary towards the end. But it's interesting rewatching it this time around. I was like, you're right. It does these weird kind of tonal handbrake turns, right? And it's sort of the same with Fear when we talk about that, where these movies really are rom-com into slasher movie into it's a really strange mix. But I think there are moments, like you said, this movie's super watchable. I think that's probably because of the performances, Julia Roberts, and when the horror, when we get the horror works, I think, as well. I think the first 10-15 minutes of this where she's in this abusive marriage are really scary and horrible, and then I think the kind of final act is also really, really tense and exciting. I think it's great. It works really well.
Yeah, and I think especially the opening of this film is so iconic. The house on the beach and it's all windows, and we'll talk about that more. But I think there's a real reason why Leigh Whannell pulled a lot of that for his remake of The Invisible Man, which came out in 2020.
Yes, I kept thinking about The Invisible Man watching this, right? Obviously, it must have massively influenced him. It shares a lot more DNA with Sleeping with the Enemy than it does with the original Invisible Man from the 1930s, right? It's that is really interesting.
Yes.
And maybe we should start by talking about that. There is, this is something I've been talking about a lot with people, obviously, through this sort of home invasion topic, the home itself and the role that it plays. And so often these movies are about big affluent homes, and usually I don't know what it is, Alex, why is it that so many rich people's homes are mainly glass, they want you to look in on them, right? But I've noticed that it's movies like Parasite and whatever else, the richer you are, the more glass you have in your house, apparently.
Which was the title of another deeply stupid and wonderful film starring Lily Sobieski called The Glass House.
There you go.
Which, if you're looking for something else to watch, I highly recommend that. But I think it has to do with the hubris and power that comes from that social class. Martin beats Laura in front of a window.
Yeah.
And granted, you're on the beach, it's Cape Cod, so maybe there's not a lot of people walking their dogs, but the notion of being able to do that with daylight streaming in, with the daylight horror of it all happening in front of us is really intense. And it's truly fear, because then I think, without overtly stating it, even though they do kind of overtly state it in some other dialogue, but there is no one to help her. There is no one around. It is all in the open to some degree, and she has to live with it until she can do something different.
That stuff is powerful. Like I said, I think that first act of the film is still harrowing. And I think it's partly the casting of Julia Roberts, who I associate with rom-coms, right? I associate with Pretty Woman, with, later on in her career, Notting Hill and My Best Friend's Wedding and stuff like that, right? And seeing her in this marriage that at first seems normal and happy and then suddenly becomes extremely abusive and horrific when the curtain is pulled back and we realise what this husband is really really like with her. That stuff is still, I think, quite upsetting and harrowing, you know. And I know Julia Roberts has talked in interviews about how this stuff was quite upsetting for her to actually even film it. And as you mentioned earlier, there weren't a lot of great kind of support procedures put in place when filming scenes like this. I believe that she was accidentally actually punched or kicked in one of these scenes when she's being beaten. So I think all of that kind of adds to this feeling of, it feels like a very, very uncomfortable, disturbing, quite upsetting movie, you know, particularly in that first act.
Yeah. And again, it's, you know, being able to share these kinds of stories is important. And not, again, like, this was a time, early 90s, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have resources. If you were in a similar situation, maybe you didn't know where to turn. But the idea that this is starting to generate a discourse and a conversation within popular culture about abuse that not only happens behind closed doors, but also between a husband and a wife.
Yeah.
Is very different.
Well, it's a real eye-opening thing, I think, when you learn some stats about, like, I think the first time I heard about this was actually on Faculty of Horror. I think it might have been when you guys were discussing Rosemary's Baby, and you mentioned that at the time marital rape was legal, you know, and actually, even when Sleeping with the Enemy came out, it was still legal in some states. It wasn't completely, marital rape wasn't completely illegal in all 50 states until 1993, right? Which is terrifying and horrific. And again, it adds to that this theme that we're exploring this series of the horror is so often actually in the home with you, right?
Well, and if you think about the origins of marriage, it's the woman is transfer of property.
Yes.
And, you know, especially I think Sleeping with the Enemy, because we have access to two houses within this film. And the first one is very much Martin's. It's very clear. He has a lot of money. He's one of those like vague investment bankers or whatever it is. And so he has all the power. He has all the money. He gets to do essentially whatever he wants when he wants. And then we get to see the inverse of this when Laura makes a run for it, moves to Iowa, to the small town, what her home looks like.
Yeah.
It is the complete opposite of what Martin's house looks like.
Yes. You're so right about that as well, about like that marriage being this kind of like transference of a bride, right? Like my wife actually last year when we were getting married, she said she did not want to do the whole like being given away by her dad kind of thing, and I hadn't even really thought about it until she brought that up, and I was like, oh yeah, that is, what a weird fucking thing that it's this ceremony where a father like hands his daughter over to a man, and I never really thought about it, but it's literally called giving you away, right? As well, it's like it's so strange, and you're so right, like that kind of stuff is just kind of embedded, isn't it, into our society and into our culture in a quite frightening way. And
I think thankfully, you know, a lot of us in our generation, a bit older and a bit younger, who are getting married or choosing to get married, it's about love. It's about romance. It's like, I want to throw a great party for my friends. And I think those are the reasons to get married. But you have to negotiate through all of those things.
Yes.
Because at some point you got to tell your parent, like, actually, I don't want you to walk me down the aisle. Actually this. And you have to negotiate on top of that other expectations of what happens and why.
It's so true. And I think that's the thing. And Martin, this is the thing, right? He acts like throughout the whole film in his pursuit of her, it's like, this is my property that I want back, right? As well. What do you think of Martin and the portrayal of this character?
If Martin's mustache had been slightly longer, he would have just been twirling it the whole time.
Oh my God, it's so true.
It's wild. But his character, the character is written as so like over the top evil. And Patrick Bergin, the actor, I think he does a pretty good job of bringing it to life. And like the tricky thing is with a character like this is he starts out like the most evil. And you got to like keep going the most evil for like 90 minutes. And in some ways, like he doesn't have anywhere to go after the first 20 minutes. So I kind of give him credit as an actor for maintaining this sinister energy throughout the film. Because even when it kind of focuses on Laura and her journey to rebuilding her life, we still have this sense that like you know, he's going to be evil and he's going to be this looming presence in her life. And the whole time every time I watch this film, I'm always like, you can't, like, this is the best deal for you.
Yeah.
She faked her own death. Everyone thinks she's dead. This is great. No one's going to question you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's such an odd thing to do. But even when you get into the like scene in the nursing home where he's going to maybe smother her lung, and you're just like,
yeah, you're right. He is proper two-dimensional mustache twirling villain, but he's kind of great. He's kind of like, he is a really great villain in that he's so vile in every sense, isn't he? And he's kind of fun. Like, I imagine Patrick Bergen must have had fun playing him in a way, as much fun as you can in some of these scenes that they had to do. But yeah, I think he's great. And what about Julia Roberts herself then? Like, this was like right at the beginning / her sort of peak of her career, wasn't it, really? Because I think this movie, she was filming it when Pretty Woman came out.
Yeah, very, very close, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, you know, all of a sudden, whilst making this film, she became the biggest star in the world, right? Julia Roberts, who was 22 when this film was shot, and at the time, she became the youngest actress ever to earn a 7-figure fee for a single performance, right? Unbelievable. What do you think of her in this movie?
I don't necessarily rate her as an actor, but I think she is like a true movie star.
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, she can hold the camera. She has charm. She has charisma. I'm not, you know, upset when I'm watching her, you know, do things. I'm invested. She creates that kind of pathos. The only kind of real issue I have with her in this film is that she actually just feels too young. Because she was like 22 when they shot this. And again, like, I don't think she's bad in this at all. I would have been curious to see possibly the character age up a bit or have an older actor in the role, maybe in the 30s. And I think that could have done, it could have added a bit more weight to it, maybe. But I also think because of Julia Roberts' talent, she does a lot of the heavy lifting, smoothing over some of those tonal shifts I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, she's very good. Yeah, and you do wonder, don't you? It's like, how did these two get together in the first place? Like, what did she see in this weird guy who likes to line up all of his towels perfectly and have sex to that music from The Shining? That was all I kept thinking about.
Wild. Like, beyond yours and mine obsession with The Shining, like, just that piece of music alone, like, if someone put that on, I would be like, I have to leave.
That when they're at that party and they're kind of like making eyes at each other and they're like, yeah, let's go home and fuck. And so they go home together, you know, and you think this is the moment, right, here we go, we're in the 90s erotic thriller moment here, we're going to get a kind of steamy, sleazy sex scene. And the first thing they do is chuck on a CD of the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique Fifth Movement, right, which is the dream of the witch's Sabbath. This horrific music that was used in The Devils, famously The Shining, and a whole bunch of other things, right? It's hilarious.
And then it's clear that it's not like just the movie doing it. It's not a narrative construct. It's the character Martin putting on this music because it comes back throughout the film.
Yes, it's the first red flag, right? And then it's the next morning when you get the next red flag with lining up the towels. Because that's the other thing about this home, right? Like you mentioned, this kind of, the house at the beginning is so ordered, right? Everything is kind of like clean lines and everything is lined up perfectly. All of the labels are lined up. And when she gets her own home later on in the movie, it is deliberately a bit kind of like messier and scrappy. It's still beautiful, but a kind of a little bit messier and scrappier, isn't it? I think, and more cozy compared to this home at the beginning. Yeah,
it's much more kind of like rustic Gilmore Girls-esque aesthetic.
Yes. So then, like, you get that whole sequence when she kind of fakes her own death and everything, and then it kind of moves into this like new section of the movie. What do you think of this kind of middle chunk of the movie where then it's just kind of like girl meets guy, Julia Roberts meets, I think, Ben, right, played by Kevin Anderson?
Yes.
Friendly, hunky drama teacher. What do you think of this whole like section of the movie?
Well, I think for you and I, it's like former like drama majors. It's like, what?
Yeah.
That was none of my teachers.
I
will say, like, this is the hardest part of the film to, well, like the hardest as an audience member to get through as in the film, because the first like 30 or so minutes, when you understand the situation up to her getting on the bus to go to Iowa, it is so well paced.
Yes.
It is like boom, 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 boom. You're getting so much information. Things are happening and it feels very organic. And by the time you're at like 36 minutes in, she's got a new house and setting up her new life. And so I say it's hard to watch as an audience member because, it gets boring quite quickly. Yes. And any montage that involves 2 songs, one of which is Brown Eyed Girl, are like, do we need this?
No.
Do we need this? I felt like we need to pad this film out so it gets to 90 minutes. I think as a critic, as a feminist critic, I like the idea of taking, significant pause within the film to show a survivor of abuse establishing a new life and a life on her terms. I wish this new life had less to do with like a romance straight out of the gate. Maybe she made friends or something else, but that's me in 2023 saying that. So.
Agreed. And I feel like the film isn't as interested. Like you said, it almost feels like it's having to fill. Like the fact that we have to keep cutting away to Martin, like asking people where, pursuing her, right? Like
also the brief montage of him looking through her like box and labeled Laura's personal effects is
so good.
Oh my god, perfect movie.
Some of those moments with Martin are so random, like when he just like attacks the wrong drama teacher and that drama teacher's like, no, there's like 7 of us in the department.
There are dozens of drama teachers.
So good. I'm like, what is this school with all these drama? Like we had one
in like this tiny town in Iowa.
Yeah.
And also, what were the productions they were putting on at this school? Like it was every costume from every era of like theater styles. And I was like, oh my God, this is madness.
Let's just take a moment as well to appreciate the moment when she dresses as a man and wears a moustache so that she can go visit her mother in disguise. That was brilliant. That's one of those classic earnest moments from one of these movies that it wasn't even played for laughs. Like it was just a genuine moment of her being able to see her mother and feel safe, right? But she's wearing a moustache. It's so good.
And like Ben is helping her do it, and I was just like, because you got the sexy version of that in 9.5 Weeks when Kim Basinger actually does the same thing with the mustache and all of that, and they wind up having sex in a sewer.
Yes.
But sorry, 9.5 Weeks is just such a weird movie, and we don't talk about that enough as a culture.
It's true.
If you want to do your next season on 9.5 Weeks, I am available for 2 months straight.
We'll do 9.5 episodes. I can't wait. Yeah, let's do it.
But no, it's such a, like, again, like, it's, she's having to disguise herself to, like, reach her family. And, like, I think there's, like, thematic stuff in there that might be interesting, but it's shot so seriously and so dead on that it's actually just distracting from the whole thing.
Yes, it really is. It's really funny. And then, of course, we get to like the big showdown at the end. Apparently, again, this was kind of controversial at the time, the fact that she shot and killed her husband in the movie. Even in self-defense, that was still like, oh my goodness, a woman shot her husband on screen in this mainstream movie. Apparently, that was like unacceptable. Hilarious.
And especially because the film takes pains to show that he would have shot her.
Yes, exactly.
But the guy, like, they're out of bullets.
Do you know what, though? I do really like this final act, the build-up when Julia Roberts arrives home and she knows that somebody has been in her house and that music is playing, the bathtub is flooded, and then the moment when she opens the cupboard and all of the labels are perfectly, neatly lined up and she knows that her terrifying ex-husband is back.
So for me, it's like, this theme of like the hand towels, the tea towels being perfectly arranged, the stuff in the cupboards being perfectly arranged comes up a few times within the film. And then when it's all like, they're all put back in order at the end of the film, and that's when she knows Martin's in the house and he's found her.
Yes.
It just, I know it's supposed to be scary, but it makes me laugh. And
well, because it is quite absurd when you actually step back and think about it.
And I think because like Roberts goes so hard with her with her reactions, as I think she's really trying to play an emotional honesty as an abuse survivor, which I think is great. But she actually like falls back in like panic and fear and shock at like an organized cupboard. And I'm like, that's just great, because now you know where all your spices are. Right?
Exactly. I kind of thought that myself. Like, are you, is this something you do, Alex? Are you a very neat and tidy person at home? Do you line everything up nicely?
Yeah. I actually cannot leave my tea towels. You know what some of my tea towels, Mike?
Yeah.
I iron them.
Oh, wow. That is like above and beyond.
Because some of them are thinner.
Yeah.
So I don't like it when they look crumpled.
See, I am terrible at ironing. I don't bother ironing, but I am definitely somebody who would I like to see the spices. Like, I like to see the labels. I do that. Because otherwise, I've just got to root around and I don't know what I'm
Then you're wasting your own time.
Exactly.
By being organized, you are helping your future self.
Exactly, right? Exactly. I think that makes sense, Alex. I think that there's nothing wrong with a bit of order. And if that means that we are also psychopaths, then so be it. You know?
That's our issues are for us to know and for other people to find out.
Exactly that. So there you go. Sleeping with the Enemy. It did get like I think it was one of those classic examples of a movie that wasn't very well received by critics, but did make a hell of a lot of money, right? Audiences loved it. I know loads of people that love this movie, even like non-horror, quote-unquote non-horror fans. When I talked about watching Sleeping with the Enemy, bunch of friends were like, oh my God, that's the one with the guy that sneaks into the house and lines up the spices or whatever. It's like people remember this movie from the 90s, and I think people remember it really fondly of a certain, well, probably our generation, right? I think it's really interesting. But yeah, how do you think this movie kind of holds up now, sort of 20, 30 plus years on?
You know, I would say for a trashy thriller, I mean, again, I'm going to use erotic thriller in quotes because there's so little about this film that is erotic. But it definitely kind of falls in there. I would say it holds up pretty well. It's an interesting artifact of Julia Roberts' career. Partially, you know, as we already talked about, she didn't really go back to thrillers a lot. I think she's experimenting a bit more now. And I think it's also an interesting artifact of the kind of discussions we were having as a culture at the time around abuse, around marriage, around homes. We could be talking about partner abuse, but only when it's done to the extreme. And I think, if we think about abuse in this film, I'm glad that it, opened up this discourse. It's still, we're talking about it now. I think there's still stuff to talk about within it. I would say the problematic thing about this film is that it shows abuse to the extreme. Again, with the mustache twirling villain, and he's so evil and she is so wronged, and she is like practically the perfect victim. And as we all know, there are no perfect victims. Abuse is usually very secret. There can be degrees of it. So like where it was in 1991, I think it did some interesting work around this. I think now looking back at it, we kind of see it as this like out of date, relic of its time. And I also think, just as like a feminist critic, I have a lot of issues with like safety for Laura being shown as entering another romantic relationship.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think that's where the film falls down, is that whole Ben romance. But like, if they could have found a way to remove that and replace it with something better, I think this would have been a better film,
Yeah, like Neighbors or Friend or something. Yeah. Because one of the interesting things I think about the film is that you go from, as we mentioned, this huge glass house on the beach, no one's around, to this neighborhood, beautiful home, but Laura seems to have no interaction with the neighbors, outside of like spotting Ben in the garden. But you could have flipped that, like flip some genders. Maybe they're friends, maybe they're, he's a man, but maybe they're just friends. Like you could have had a lot more stuff going on in that. And I found it was so interesting, especially, as we talked about when you go into like the killer POV of Martin when he gets to the house, and you really realize the distinction between the houses. One, again, you have the big open windows, just windows, side of windows is that first house. To this one where you actually lose Laura for parts of the stocking because the windows are smaller. She's more, she's hidden in. She's got a place where she can kind of disappear into a little bit.
And you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about it, but you're so right about that he starts at like 11 out of 10, and there's not really anywhere for him to go beyond that. And I think it could have worked better had that kind of like insidious evil sort of built up to create something much more frightening in that final act. I think that's one thing that I think Leigh Whannell's The Invisible Man did quite well, because the obviously, apart from the fact that when he was invisible, but when you see the husband, he doesn't ever show his hand. Like, he performs as this kind of like quote unquote nice guy through a lot of the film, right? And I think that is in some ways even more scary and effective than this kind of out and out mustache twirling villain. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Because then it becomes a journey for us, the audience, to discover how evil this person is. And then you've actually got a character who knows more than us.
Yes.
Navigating the situation. And we might be like, I wonder why she's doing all of this. And then the film reveals itself to you. And I think that's much more interesting and engaging. But again, it's really cool that we've got, two films that I think are, directly in dialogue with each other, Sleeping with the Enemy and then Leigh Whannell's The Invisible Man, which came out in 2020, and, getting to see where this conversation has gone to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go. Well, that is Sleeping with the Enemy from 1991.
Here they are, all filled out and signed by yours truly. Wasn't that nice of me?
What are they?
Why, they're your physicals, of course. We can't go to camp without our physicals now, can we? Just be careful not to tell anyone how you got them. Oh, no, I'm afraid that they wouldn't approve of that at all. Even though they know that I am a doctor.
No matter what they do, I'll never tell.
Oh, you're such a dear.
That insane clip you just heard there was from one of the most insane horror movies to come out of the early 1980s. That's Sleepaway Camp from 1983, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. Can you believe it? That is one of the many movies that we are going to be screening as part of a special UK-wide tour in October, the Evolution of Horror's Tour of Terror. It's happening. We are going to be coming all over the UK throughout the month of October to host a bunch of screening events, panel discussions, live podcasts on stage at a range of different venues. If you head to evolutionofhorror.com/events, you will see details of all of the places we're going to on our tour and all of the films and events that we're going to be hosting. But briefly, we can tell you now that we're coming to Oxford at the beginning of the month. We're going to be guests at the Shocktober Festival. Then we're going to be heading to Manchester from the 6th to the 8th of October for the brilliant Grimfest. That's a brilliant horror festival that's going to be happening in Manchester. We're going to be hosting a whole bunch of events and live discussions at the festival. Then we're going to be heading to Liverpool to host a special screening of Child's Play. Then we're heading to Edinburgh. After that, Newcastle for Sleepaway Camp. Then we're heading down to York for a 50th anniversary of Don't Look Now. Then Leeds at the beautiful Hyde Park Picture House for a screening. And we're finishing down in Reading on the 19th of October for a special 50th anniversary screening of a little film called The Exorcist. So that's Manchester, Oxford, Reading, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Newcastle, York, and Leeds. And we may be adding more events and more locations to that over the next few weeks. So if you want to grab your ticket, if we're coming to a town near you to host a special horror screening and live podcast, grab your ticket, come along and join us for some spooky fun in the month of October. The details of all the events, the dates, the times, the ticket pages will be found on our website, evolutionofhorror.com/events.
Don't you swear at me, you little shit! Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother! Do you understand? All I do is worry and slave and defend you, and all I get back is that fucking face on your face!
Those were, of course, the beautiful dulcet tones of Toni Collette in Hereditary, a performance that is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror performances of all time. Obviously, she was shamefully robbed of an Oscar nomination that year, even though so many people consider it to be one of the all-time great cinema performances. And I wonder exactly where that performance is going to place on this year's Patreon poll, because we announced this week that this summer's top 50 poll is going to be the top 50 horror performances of all time. So for anyone who doesn't know, every year over on Patreon, we do a Patreon-wide poll where we will ask everyone to vote for favourites in a particular topic. The first year, we asked people to vote for their 10 scariest moments in horror. The following year, it was their 10 favourite horror movies. And last year, we asked everyone to vote for their top 10 horror movie monsters. Then we collate the hundreds and hundreds of lists and create a definitive top 50 countdown. So this year, I've asked patrons, all 1,200 of them, to send in their top 10 horror movie performances. So if you want to join that poll and listen to the results at the end of the summer in a very special 2-part top 50 countdown episode, then sign up to our Patreon and get involved. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Signing up at the $5 level will get you access to our top 50 poll, as well as a whole bunch of other bonus episodes. Or you can jump up to a $10 level where you will get new bonus episodes every single week. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Alex West and I discuss the ridiculous but very fun Fear from 1996.
Ooh la la. Stop being so obvious.
He wants you bad.
No, you're not at all like what I expect you to be the first time I saw you.
Oh, so?
You're just sweet. Dad, meet David McCall.
Pleasure to meet you, sir.
Same here, David. Nicole's curfew is 12 o'clock.
All right.
Hello. Yeah. You remember that song and dance about David in some perfect little town back east?
Something like that.
Well, guess again. He's got no family, no address, no work record.
What's the big deal?
Big deal, Laura, is that the guy gives me the creeps, and the girl is my daughter.
Teenager Nicole lives with her upper-class blended family in a private community outside of Seattle. Her father, Stephen, is trying to build a relationship with her, but is pulled away due to his demanding job. Nicole meets David, a handsome guy from the wrong side of the tracks who disarms her with his sweet demeanor. Almost immediately, Stephen suspects something is not right with David and is proven right as he becomes possessive, abusive, and violent towards Nicole, her friends, and their family.
So another violent, nasty, obsessive male partner. This time they're like 16 years old though, or whatever, right? So like, what do you make of this movie, Alex?
I feel so gross every time I watch this movie, particularly, well, really as an adult. It is a patriarchal nightmare realized in a way that reestablishes and affirms the conservative values that Nicole is trying to rebel against. The politics of fear, the film, are so much more overt than sleeping with the enemy, and Nicole is a pawn between two men who, and, you know, if we talk about, you know, Laura rebelling against, you know, being seen as property and getting her own property, Nicole is just, you know, being, you know, ping pong between her dad and David. Yeah, you're right. I'd kind of forgotten. I hadn't seen this movie since the 90s probably. Wow. And I'd sort of forgotten how much of this movie is actually about Mark Wahlberg and the dad. It's like these two guys fighting over this girl, right? Like, it's a really weird dynamic that this movie introduces, that it's about like daddy's little girl being like corrupted or sullied by this man, right? I think I read an article where somebody said this whole movie plays out like a dad's nightmare rather than a teenage girl's nightmare, right? It's really interesting, and I think that passed me by when I first saw this as like a kid, you know? It's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of, you know, people in our generation were experiencing with this film, if and when we do come back to it, because it was a total sleepover film. Yeah. When I was a kid, and I didn't think it was like gross or weird. I was like, "Ew, we're gonna watch this sexy, dangerous film." And I think that's what we all thought. And now it's like, oh no. And when I was watching it the other night, I was posting a lot of stories to my Instagram about it because my cats were not helping me process this film. And I was like, I need to like get this out of my brain in some way. And it was so interesting. I had so many like people responding to the stories in my DMs, really divided on like, I love this movie. I think it's sexy. Someone even tried to make an argument that it was like an absurd feminist fantasy. And I was like, I'm not there with you, but I respect your take.
Yes.
And then a lot of other people, and then some other people just saying like, oh yeah, this is so weird now. Oh my God, that scene, you know.
Oh, it is such a weird film. Like, where does it lie for you in the kind of, because, you know, you've written a book about 90s teen horror. Where does this kind of lie for you in that kind of wave of 90s teen movies that we got? Because this was, what, 96? So sort of at the beginning of that teen slasher era, I guess?
Yeah, so within erotic thrillers, fear comes out when erotic thrillers are firmly established as a subgenre in their own right. They're kind of believed to be like a little bit of a cinematic mainstay at this time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Hollywood wants to continue to expand the reach of these films. So what makes sense is to go to the teens. We've got the adults, we've got the couples, we're making them scared of leaving their marriages. So now we should make the teens, teen girls in particular, scared of leaving the family home and going off with another guy. And I would say within the teen horror cycle, it's a really interesting entry because this comes out the same year as Scream.
Yeah.
And this film, Fear, feels firmly made by adult men. Without the transcendent subversiveness of Scream.
Yeah, it needed Kevin Williamson to write it, maybe, you know?
You know what? I would be down for like a Kevin Williamson remake of this.
Yeah, and it is really interesting how in that wave of 90s movies, we got like, it was like the teen version of Dangerous Liaisons with Cruel Intentions, the teen version of, Taming of the Shrew, or, you know, teen version of Pygmalion, teen version of, this is kind of the teen Fatal Attraction, isn't it? And it does feel like an interesting transitional point between the 90s erotic thrillers and the 90s teen movies in that regard, you know. But it's interesting. I don't know. There is something much more icky about this movie in making it about teens. And maybe it's not even just the teen element. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's to do with the parent element and the fact that it does feel so much like it's been made by a load of older men than it does people that sort of understand teens. I don't know. But then again, teens liked it, right? I mean, like you said, this was a big sleepover movie at the time. So
I think, and I don't want to disregard this because, you know, you take what you take from a film when you watch it.
Yeah.
And I wasn't taking all this kind of, I wasn't overtly taking on, you know, this patriarchal nightmare. I can't disagree that it maybe affected me, but I know so many people who had like a full-on sexual awakening to the roller coaster scene.
Oh my God. But I don't want to mock that and take that away from people either. But watching it as an adult in your 30s, I was like, this is one of the most hilarious, cringy things I've ever seen in my life. The roller coaster fingering moment is brilliant. Everything about it. That like Sunday's cover version of Wild Horses. The fact that the roller coaster goes over the dip as she sort of climaxes. It's absolutely amazing.
The look on Mark Wahlberg's face, I was like, jail, put him in jail. This is horrifying.
It is. But, you know, you're right. Like, you don't want to, you know, because I could say that too. I have said that too about multiple scenes from the Twilight movies as well. Like, but these movies aren't for me in my mid-30s, are they? That's the thing. And like, I'm sure that for a massive teenage audience at the time, that was incredible stuff, right?
And I mean, listen, I had my sexual awakening watching Gavin Rossdale and Bush videos. So who am I to talk?
There you go. Exactly. Yeah, why not? And, you know, so it is. And, you know, Mark Wahlberg whatever you think of Mark Wahlberg, he's pretty good in this movie as like a horrible obsessive psycho boyfriend, and Reese Witherspoon's a great actress, I think, and those two probably do a certain amount of heavy lifting, I think, as well, towards being able to take this film seriously at all.
I think they're both fine.
Yeah.
In the film.
Yeah.
I think they're both fine. I think the film has had a longevity because of them, because they both got on to become stars.
Yes.
I think at the time, it was also a really interesting avenue for William Peterson, who plays Stephen, the dad, to come back in.
Yeah.
Because he'd largely left the film industry, and I think had a young family and was raising them and, living his own life, probably his own version of Fear, and then kind of came back. He was doing parts here and there, but like this kind of felt like, the one of the first major things he had done in a long time.
Yeah. I mean, at this point, this was so early in Mark Wahlberg's career. This was when he was Marky Mark, essentially, right? Teenage underwear model / maybe racist thug as well, right?
It is. I didn't obviously pick up on this when I was watching it as a teen, but now watching basically anything with Mark Wahlberg, I always just think of racialized violence.
Yeah, for sure.
There was also there's a very brief scene in the film, and I feel like you might appreciate this if you don't already know it, but there's a brief scene in the film. It's when Nicole is starting to pull away. She's kind of realizing, maybe this isn't so good. And there's just a 10-second scene of him sitting at a bar with a drink in front of him, and he's just looking angry and pissed off. And there's a kind of aggressive, rappy song, hip hop song playing, and that's actually a Marky Mark song.
Huh.
So this film exists within a universe where Mark Wahlberg is playing the character of David, but Marky Mark also exists and is played in bars.
Oh my God. Well, that's a very 90s meta thing to do, isn't it? That feels like a Kevin Williamson thing to do in a way, right?
I bet there is a multiverse cut of Fear out there.
Oh my God. I love it. Also, just to say that movie did now ruin Wild Horses for me, because that song was one as a Buffy fan of the 90s. That was the iconic moment from Buffy's prom with Angel. This lovely, wholesome moment, right? And now I'm going to think of Reese Witherspoon being fingered on a roller coaster every time I hear that song. So
I'm going to think of the face that Mark Wahlberg makes me doing it.
Yeah, that face. Oh my God.
That face is my sleep paralysis demon. It's chilling.
Yeah, it is absolutely chilling. And there is a weird dynamic between this family as well. I'm really keen to ask you what you make of the stepmother, Laura, because what a strange character.
The true villain of the film.
Well, so is she a villain? Is she an ally? What is because at the beginning of the film she calls her a slut and stuff, and then she kind of ends up being a little bit more understanding than the dad. But what do you make of her generally?
This is where you get the sense of the blended family, and I think she is kind of the lightning rod for that, because she is an adult figure within the home. She has her own son, who kind of saves the day in the end, I guess. That's weird. But she's kind of in between, again, being this authority figure within the home and then having a lot of very strong feelings about how Nicole is living her life. And she kind of oscillates between being really hard on her, really, saying some pretty cruel things to her, and then just wanting to comfort her and wanting to protect her and wanting to be oh, okay, I fucked up. I want to, make this better with my new stepdaughter. But in the end, it's she goes too hard on her when she shouldn't, and is too soft on her when she should be, a bit tougher. Yeah. But the whole scene of her, helping Reese cover up the black eye.
Yeah.
And even though, Nicole is saying, it was a volleyball thing in gym, there's something there, and then how she explains it to Steven, it just makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, interesting. That she knows what's really going on and she's just continuing to let it happen, or
I don't know it, but I don't think it's that. It's more so the oh, well, here's a woman's secret. This is how we cover up bruises. Right. This is how we, again, even though Nicole is saying this is a volleyball gym class thing, it's why are we covering up bruises? Why is this a woman's thing to be doing that? Like a woman's trick? Like there's a layer there that I don't like that, again, it kind of feeds into a lot of, toxic narratives around, protectiveness around the patriarchy and female bodies and how, we can make ourselves smaller in support of the patriarchal system.
The moment as well when the dad walks in, my wife walked in when I was midway through watching this film and she hadn't seen it, and she walked in on the scene when the dad spots the condom under the bed and starts yelling.
This is great. I have so much to say about this.
Right. It's such a weird scene because he kind of starts yelling at her. And my wife was like, oh, okay, so is the dad meant to be like the real villain of this movie? I was like, no, I don't think he actually is. I don't think we're supposed to think he's the bad dad, right?
He's the best dad.
Oh.
He is the best man. He is the best character to ever appear on screen, according to this film.
It's really weird.
But that scene is so interesting because, again, like Nicole's relationship with David is falling apart, and the stepmom is trying to comfort her in one of those weird scenes I was mentioning, and then Stephen walks in and is trying to insert himself, and then as he leaves, he sees the condom wrapper, and he's so angry. He starts talking about her ruining her life and all of this stuff. And listen, David is a walking red flag.
Yes.
He is evil, abusive, toxic, all of that. But safe sex. Safe sex is cool.
Hey.
Everyone should have safe sex. And it was just like, I don't think she's going to ruin her life if she uses a condom.
Yeah, exactly. This is the thing. If this movie was made now in 2023, that would be a moment where the parent would be relieved that their child was using protection, right? Not angry that their child is having sex, I think.
I would hope so.
Yeah, I think so. Teen movies have come a long way, I think, sort of post Booksmart than they were in this from this movie. But it's a really interesting thing. And again, it's like something I completely forgot, having not seen this movie in over 20 years, probably, that this isn't just a movie about David and Nicole. It's this whole weird, very strange family dynamic that we've got going on in this home, Also, by the way, what an incredible house this house is as well. Holy shit, these people have money, don't they? Oh my God.
This is like the era of the 90s when every rich character was like an architect.
Yeah. And also just every 90s teen movie, they all must be multi-millionaires, right? Again, like Scream, these houses in Woodsboro and like these, again, like this era, it's just like property porn.
Well, and it's interesting because like the film is very much set in Seattle. They reference it a lot.
Yes.
They appear to be in a gated community outside of Seattle. And there's a lot of, who gets access to this space, who gets, the code to get into the house, who gets this. And then all of the stuff of Nicole just kind of being like, well, my friends can come over, like David wants to come over late at night, so he gets the code. Like all of these things, all of these anxieties about who they are keeping out and aggressively trying to keep out. And then how a weak teen girl's mind is manipulated into like letting these people in is like, my dudes.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you're right. It's interesting that you said that people had, kind of see this as a kind of subversive or feminist in some way. Like, I don't know. Or maybe there is a reading in that in some way, in the way that Nicole, she does kind of defy her dad and sort of say, stay the fuck out of my life throughout most of this movie, and sort of does what she wants to do. But that's as much as I can see in that theory. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also like a reading where, she has sex for pleasure. The sex is safe.
Yeah.
But when she has sex, that's when she invites him in. That's when he gets the code. That's when all of this starts to kick off in a way. And so, I think like safe, consensual, fun sex, like amazing. Yes, please. But it shows ultimately this film that once you invite this kind of relationship into your life, you don't know what else comes with it. You are basically opening yourself up to, the worst things imaginable. And you better hope that William Peterson is your father and that he can save you.
Yeah. And we definitely see that in poor Margot, right? The best friend character who feels like she is just literally there to be punished for being sexually active, right?
All of these Margot scenes are what I have the biggest issues with within the film. They are so upsetting.
Yeah, they are.
They are so traumatic. Even the scenes of like Margot and Nicole talking, where she's just like, sometimes guys just beat you.
Oh my God, I know. Does the film know that that's absurd?
I really think they're just trying to make teen girls scared of leaving the home and having sex.
Yeah.
Because like Margot's kind of shown as, being very sexually open. She talks about like, you remember your first, but not all of the others.
Yeah.
Like sometimes guys beat you.
Yeah.
She's, gets raped by Mark Wahlberg's character and is then blamed for it. And he almost runs her off the road. Like it's showing that maybe you know people like this, but they are in their own like circle of hell. And she's basically like inert by the end of it. Yeah. Thank God she survives, but like at what cost?
Yeah. I know. It's fucked up, actually. There is stuff about this movie that is more disturbing than Sleeping with the Enemy, even, I think. And I do think that actually then, when we get to the real horror in the final act, the home invasion final act, I think is really effective as well. Like, again, Mark and this group of like lackeys that he has that attack this house. That sequence is really good and really powerful, I think, in a kind of frightening home invasion way. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and I think you have to keep in mind that it's a dual home invasion because Stephen goes to David and his buddy's house first. Yes. And he fucks up that house after David fucks up his car. And again, this is where we get back into woman as property. You fuck with my car, I fuck with your house. You fuck with my daughter, I do this. Yeah. It's tit for tat all the time. Though there is one, I think, very funny moment during this kind of, move towards the climax of the film after Stephen's like busted up their house and you got the David's buddy with the kind of long hair just looking very sadly at his broken pool cue.
Yeah.
He just looks so like, oh. Yeah, it does. And he's like, we got to go get him back. And he's like, one of the most aggressive.
His Marky Mark's weird fucking bedroom with his weird crucifix and his shrine to Nicole and everything. It's so weird. It's really dark.
And like the Nicole forever.
Oh my God, yeah, we haven't even talked about his tattoo, have we, as well? There's a classic moment when he brands himself.
I think that is one of the ongoing, things of fear is it taught a lot of people how to give themselves tattoos.
Yeah. And how
I know some friends who have some dodgy tattoos from that era because of this film.
Oh my God. It's so unhinged, this movie, isn't it? And he goes full campy villain by the end. Like, that's the thing, like, compared to when Martin is Sleeping with the Enemy, you do see this progression in David, right? To the point where then when he's at the end shouting through the peephole, that iconic shot of him shouting through the peephole of the front door, and he's gone like full maniac.
It all could have been different, Mr. Walker. You should have allowed nature to take its course. In the end, it will anyway. So let me in the fucking house!
Yeah, and I think, when you start a home invasion sequence with a beheaded dog.
Oh, shit, as well. That's horrible. Yeah, that's pretty grim.
And I think, because of the film and so much of, David's twists and turns throughout the film are very absurd, very unexpected, very over the top. We've already, just mentioned the tattooing, his shrine. We don't know what he's going to do next. So purposefully, he feels like a very unsafe character. And when he's in charge of 4 or 5 other dudes who are able to wreak havoc on this home, which is meant to be so protected, I think the stepmom even says to Stephen at one time, you designed this house to be safe. Mm-hmm. And then Nicole's like, we need him and then so we see the patriarchal force within this film has designed a space to keep them safe. But then the elusive teen daughter has gone out and brought the wrong side of the tracks, quote unquote, home to them. And now this kind of violence is being wrought on them because of Nicole's, desire for David and desire for sex or whatever, however you want to label it. But it becomes very unwieldy, especially as it's, Margot is traumatized. She's there. Seems like his friend is going to assault or does assault Nicole herself. All of these things are happening and ratcheting up, and you feel very unstable in a very purposeful way in this film.
And you're so right about, these kids being from the quote unquote wrong side of the tracks. There has always been this kind of there has always been this kind of class element to home invasion, it feels like, right? Obviously, that is very much kind of overt and on the surface nowadays with films like Parasite and the kind of like the have-nots invading the houses of the haves often or whatever. I think sometimes some films do that in really kind of smart, interesting ways that say something. I'm not sure this film has anything to say about that, right?
No, it is treating like anyone who's, again, quote unquote, lower class as dangerous, as someone to be aware of, as someone to be concerned about. It was funny, just talking about class. Like I was on vacation in Paris about a month ago, and my friend who I was with, she and I went to Versailles. And have you ever been to Versailles?
I don't think I have, no.
I feel like you would remember, because it's very, like, we all know, it's very, very opulent. My friend Jenny and I, like, of course, seen photos. We knew about Versailles, and even just going there and being there, it's so opulent. It is so over the top, like, even knowing what we were going to see. And then my friend, she was like, she made a great point. She was like, God, imagine having your family die and be eaten by rats and then storming this place. With no sense of what you were going to see. Yeah. And then just seeing this level of grandeur and being like, oh.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So perhaps that is the ultimate home invasion.
Oh my God.
Versailles.
I love that. Yes. So there you go. Fear. It certainly has its issues, right? But I've got to admit, like you said about Sleeping with the Enemy, there's something kind of watchable about this movie. And for all its ridiculousness, I did have quite a lot of fun watching it. But what about you? What do you think? How do you think this film kind of holds up watching it now? I mean, obviously, you covered this in the early days of Faculty of Horror too, didn't you? Which would have been, 10 years ago now?
Yeah, like 10 years ago.
Do you think that even since then, your kind of opinion of it has changed or evolved?
I think I've gotten harder on it.
Right.
I revisiting it like when 10 years ago now, so in my late 20s, it was like, oh, what the fuck is this movie? And then revisiting it for my 1990s teen horror book, it was again, what the fuck is this movie? And now for this, it's like, I literally, like, I watched so much of this film behind a cushion because I was so uncomfortable. I was so skeeved out by the whole thing. And I wanted to, like, scrub myself with steel wool when it was done. I felt gross. A lot of people love this movie, is what I have learned. And I think it's cool. I think, sure. I think that's a thing you can do with your life. Is like fear the movie.
I love it. Cruel Intentions, better or worse than this one? Ickier or less icky?
Less icky?
They definitely all do get ickier the older you get and the further away from your teens you get, I think, as well. I think that's probably a thing, but definitely I think this is ickier. And it does, like you said, it is a very, very conservative film, and I think that becomes more apparent the older I get as well.
I mean, just the end of the film. Like, Stephen seems to wield the power of like 1,000 fathers and throws David through a window like hundreds of feet. Just like, so he lands on stone and dies. Like, that is unhinged.
Also, it's so weird because what middle-aged dads are going to watch this film? Like, who is this for in some ways? Do you know what I mean?
I think this is for like teen girls to appreciate their daddies a bit more.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the dad is the Superman that swoops in and saves the day kind of thing. Yeah.
Like, ugh. Even just like down to like, I find it gross that like she has a bracelet that says Daddy's Girl, and I find it gross that David feels the need to change it to David's Girl. Like, I find all of it gross.
Well, I just love that Reese Witherspoon is now this incredible, powerful producer who makes all these cool female-centric movies, and, you know, good for her. Because
nice. Bring that back. Yeah, bring it all back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe she's thinking of, you know, fear.
I think so, yeah.
You know?
I think in some, like, she's done so many films. She's been working since she was so young.
Yeah.
So, and I think, you know, a lot of actors similar, you know, to her and her age group are kind of taking the same journey, starting their own production companies, doing stuff that makes sense and is challenging and tries to flip the script and flip narratives. And I think that is super cool and very exciting.
Very, very cool. Well, there you go. Alex, that is it. Thank you so much for joining me. My final question for you, if you have a favourite in this weird, fucked up subgenre, what is your favourite home invasion movie?
I have two, because I could not pick between them.
Yep.
First one is 2007's Inside.
Oh, yeah. What a movie.
A new French extremity classic directed by Alexandre Bustillo and Julien Maury.
Fuck me. That is scary film.
Perfect.
So good. So good.
And it's so good. And then my other one is 1974's Black Christmas, directed by Bob Clark.
Yeah. I mean, it was literally, I think I put that in my Sight and Sound top 10 movies of all time. Like, I love Black Christmas more than anything. What a film.
It's perfect.
So perfect.
It's perfect. Perfect movie.
Alex, have you seen the When a Stranger Calls movies? Like the original and the When a Stranger Calls Back from the early 90s?
So long ago.
Because this movie was a revelation to me, particularly the second one. I had never seen it until a couple of weeks ago. Watched it for the podcast. I think it was our friend Stacey Ponder who kept telling me how much she loved it.
I was about to say, this sounds like a Stacey.
And I had a few friends saying, oh my God, it's so good. I think, Alex, you would love it. It's like early 90s ridiculousness with like a killer. And this isn't really a spoiler, but he's a ventriloquist, and so he can throw his voice, and so you never know which room he's in at any given time. And it is as brilliant and ridiculous as that sounds. Like if you need something ridiculous from the early 90s to catch up on, I would recommend When a Stranger Calls Back. It's great.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm going to add that to my list because I love a bit of 90s watchable trash, as we have established in this episode.
Exactly. I thought you would. Amazing. Well, Alex, thank you so much. As always, it's such a pleasure to have you on. And just remind people where they can find you, more of your work, your podcast, and more stuff out there online.
Oh, gosh. Follow Faculty of Horror where we get your podcasts. I'm around the social medias. Yeah, I think I'm most active on Instagram now. So that is at scare_Alex over there.
Amazing. Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Stay safe.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you one more time to my brilliant guest, Alex West. So, I would love to hear your thoughts. What did you make of this week's episode? What did you make of this week's films, Sleeping with the Enemy and Fear? Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and you can find us on all the socials, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Meta, Threads, whatever it is. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can also join the discussion group, the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be really grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and it's another 2 bangers from the early 90s thriller movement. Next week, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Maha Al-Badrawi, and we are going to be talking about 2 spooky films about psychotic women from 1992. The Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female. Cannot wait to join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.